Thank you so much, Mohammed. It's my pleasure to join the World Government Summit and United Nations for these 75 minutes of global collaboration. Since the founding of the United Nations, the number of states that comprise the international community has risen to nearly 200. And the United Nations management of global decolonization and bringing sovereignty, recognition, and diplomatic dignity to so many newly independent states is one of its greatest and most irrevocable legacies. One such state is, of course, the United Arab Emirates, born, as it were, in 1971. We're delighted to be joined by two distinguished panelists, both with very future-focused mandates. Her Excellency Ohood Al Roumi, Minister of Government Development and the Future of the United Arab Emirates and Vice Chair of the World Government Summit, and His Excellency Fabrizio Hochschild, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor on the preparations for the commemoration of the UN 75th anniversary. I would note that the UAE is gearing up to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year, and we are here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Minister Ohood, let's kick off the discussion with you. With so much legacy at stake in our discussions here today and so many challenges lying ahead, are you still optimistic about the future?
Thank you, Parag. My short answer would be yes. I know that this year has been hard and difficult, and all of us around the world, whether individuals, governments, and businesses. And the impact of COVID-19 on humanity is huge and big. And yet, I think it is something that countries around the world can learn from moving forward. COVID-19 reminded us how connected we are, how important is global collaboration. So yes, despite today's challenges, Parag, I see tremendous opportunity. You know, COVID-19 forced us to live our life differently. Remote work, remote learning, more focus on health and well-being, all of course enabled with technology. These changes open doors for new sectors that will witness huge future growth, creating opportunities and future jobs. We saw, for example, the growth in technology and data sectors, the new sectors of biotechnology, circular and green economy, and also more investment in health and well-being. And to show our optimism towards that, we had the pleasure to launch the Future Possibilities Report in collaboration with the UN75, with His Excellency Fabrizio. And this report outlines 6 transformational trends that will add $30 trillion to the global economy by 2025. And I highly encourage everyone to read it. In the UAE, we did not allow COVID-19 to slow our ambition or our vision for the future. Actually, in April 2020, amid the peak of COVID-19, our Prime Minister called for a special meeting for us to discuss and plan for post-COVID world. Also, in 19th of July 2020, we launched HOPE mission, which is the first Arab mission to Mars. And the aim from this mission is to motivate a generation of Arab and young youth around the world through inspiration and scientific advancement. And also through 2020, we've been very busy planning for our next 50 years ahead of our Golden Jubilee in 2021. And I believe, Parag, that the international community should follow the same. But Parag, in addition to celebrating the last 70 years of the United Nations, we also need to, or we must look to the future. COVID-19 acted as an accelerator for many things, including global cooperation. It showed us that solutions and science have no border. And we need to build our future on strengthening global collaboration. That's why we started in the UAE 8 years ago, the World Government Summit. The World Government Summit is a platform where we bring leaders from around the world to discuss how to create a better future. And honestly, I believe the only place and time that we can create the future is here and now. The future will be shaped by the actions and the decisions that we make today. So I believe we can and we must build forward better.
Thank you so much, Minister Ohood. You really do give us reasons to be optimistic. Moving now to the United Nations, Under Secretary General Fabrizio, you are the man behind the world's biggest ever conversation on the future that we want and the UN that we need. So please tell us, what are the outcomes of UN75 and what comes next?
Thank you, Parag. And let me say at the outset what an honor it is to be in this conversation with Her Excellency Minister Ohood Al Roumi. And let me also say how appreciative we are and inspired we are by all the support, intellectual, political, and other support we have received throughout the year from the UAE. I think there are a few countries that are so forward-looking and so internationally oriented at the same time. I think there were three outcomes from our process. The first was already alluded to. We gathered on an unprecedented scale a sense of what people think about where the world is heading and where they want it to head. We found out about their priorities across the world for post-COVID recovery. We found out about their hopes and fears for our globe, and in particular, their expectations of international cooperation. I think one very striking finding that might not sound so special, but it is actually quite meaningful when across the globe our leaders seem so polarized, so divided, where there's so much friction, fragmentation on the international stage, is just how united people are around the world. United around their biggest priority in post-COVID recovery, which is better access to healthcare, better access to education, water and sanitation, and their second biggest post-COVID priority, which is more international solidarity, more care for the hardest hit countries and communities. And then also in terms of longer term priorities, the biggest fear of the world is the damage we're doing to our climate, is the damage we're doing to our environment, and that is universal. And their expectations of international cooperation are also pretty universal. They want to see more, not less. People do not see any opposition or contradiction between being true patriots, strong national lovers of their own country, and the need for greater international cooperation. They recognize that in an ever more interconnected world, you have to be international as well as patriotic. But they want to see a different sort of international cooperation, a more inclusive one. And I think the second outcome was what member states, inspired by the data we gathered, put out as a declaration. And this was very important. And it sets the agenda for the next 25 years for the UN. And it asks the Secretary General to come back with very specific proposals about how the United Nations can be upgraded. And that work has begun, and that will be transformational. But the last outcome I want to highlight is, perhaps the most important. I think we've helped to nurture growing awareness that we're at a fork in the road. And on the one hand, in light of all the threats, in light of all the uncertainty, we see many countries, many communities becoming more inward-looking, more isolationist. But if we are really to change things, there's also a growing awareness that that formula will not work. We have to better recognize just how interconnected we were, and we have to manage better the global common good. And I think if that attitude is to prevail, we need all of us to rally behind it.
Fabrizio, thank you so much for that comprehensive overview on this very wide range of activities. And Minister Ohood, Fabrizio has laid out a wide range of universal priorities that have been emphasized by the many citizens around the world that have been that they have conversed with to develop their agenda. What is the one thing that you believe should be at the center of our attention to achieve the future that we want?
No, Parag, in the last 75 minutes that we spent in this event, we discussed core issues that nobody can ignore going forward, such as our digital future, climate change, and the future of work. But if I were to focus on one issue, I would choose the one that I believe would be a powerful force for positive change, which is more women empowerment and more women in senior executive leadership positions. You know, Parag, studies around the world shows that gender balance leads to economic growth and sustainable development. But I believe there is more to it than just that. Let's just look at COVID-19. 70% of the frontliners in or fighting this pandemic are women. And countries who have more women in government senior leadership positions responded or had better responses to the pandemic overall. And yet, women are about 39% of the global workforce in the world, but they represent or they occupy only 28% of managerial positions. And in the UAE, this has been a very important pillar of our development model set by our founding father. The premise is very simple. Women represent 50% of our world, and this should be reflected in government, in workplace, and all decision spheres. Today in the UAE, 50% of our national parliament are women by law, while the global average is 25%. Women are 2/3 of university graduates and government employees, and 1/3 of our cabinets are female ministers, holding critical and important positions and portfolios such as international cooperation, advanced technologies, youth, water, and food security. I believe more needs to be done around the world to enable and support more women to take more public leadership positions. For me, Parag, to create a better world, the future is female.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. That is very, very compelling. Now, building on this, our final question for this 75-minute session, Fabrizio, you've laid out the priorities that the world community has shared with you, and you are developing this agenda for the UN75. Can you shed light for us on what is going to be the shape of multilateralism in the future?
Thank you. And of course, this is personal speculation, but it's also the direction the Secretary General is moving in and has moved in since the beginning of his tenure. First, I do think there are many hints in the excellent report that the Minister alluded to, the UAE Future Possibilities report that we had the honor in co-launching. I think I'll highlight 6 characteristics very quickly. First, I think the UN has to grow more inclusive of multilateralism, has to grow more inclusive of youth voices, more inclusive of civil society, more inclusive of cities, which have often taken the lead, as we've seen in tackling critical issues from climate change to the pandemic, and more inclusive of regional organizations. Second, I think the international organization, multilateralism, has to be more focused on what are truly global goods. There are many things governments can do on their own for which they don't need international organizations. The role of multilateralism is to focus on those things that go beyond the competencies that any individual country can resolve on their own. And obviously, on a universal nature with the United Nations, that's things like climate change, global pandemics, and upholding internationally human rights. Third, I think the future multilateralism has to be more science and data oriented, more evidence-based, less driven either by bureaucracy or by politics, but more driven by data and science. And in tackling things like climate change or the pandemic, that is absolutely essential. To the extent we politicize these problems, we undermine our ability to bring about solutions. Fourth, the multilateralism needs to be less fragmented. The problems of the world are more joined up They're more joined up and interconnected because new technologies make them more joined up and more interconnected. And we have to also work within the United Nations, between the United Nations and other organizations in a more joined up way. Fifth, I think we need to find our way back to the mindset that infused those who wrote the UN Charter. And that was an obsessive concern with future generations, with, in the words of the Charter, to save succeeding generations. You know, we live as if we were the last generation on Earth. The way we treat our environment, our climate, the way we exploit resources. We act as if there's nobody to come after us. We have very little sense of responsibility to those who will be around 50 or 100 years now. And if we want a better multilateralism, it has to be a multilateralism that thinks of the impact of our deeds today on peoples 50, 100 years from now. And finally, I would fully agree with Minister Ohood that if multilateralism is to be effective in future, it needs to be made up much more of women. And I hope that's very much the direction that we will continue to go in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Fabrizio. Thank you so much, Your Excellency Minister Ohood. You have really delivered a very comprehensive and substantive set of insights, but also been visionary and optimistic. And this should make us all much more hopeful for the future.